He's been gone a year and you're only telling us now? Sasha said, like I owed her an apology for the silence instead of an explanation for the withdrawal slips sitting in a folder on my lap. Behind her, on the sideboard, sat our father's good watch in its velvet box, the one she'd asked to have for when he's back, still ticking on her wrist that would never wear it again. I took a sip of my coffee and didn't answer right away. She didn't know yet that the silence had been the only thing standing between her and a very different conversation, one with a probate judge instead of her sister. If you've ever had to decide how long someone's ignorance was worth protecting, you already understand why I waited. My name is Naomi Ellison. I'm 34, and I spend my working life reading claims files for an insurance company, deciding what actually happened to a car, a roof, a warehouse full of ruined inventory, based on nothing but paper. People assume that job is about arguing. It's actually about proving something. You don't get paid on what you say happened. You get paid on what you can document, and everything else is just noise the file doesn't need. I learned that lesson at work. I learned the harder version of it at home years earlier, the summer I turned 11, and realized nobody in my family had ever once asked what I needed, only what I could give them. My brother, Derek, needed a cosigner for his first car. My sister, Sasha, needed a babysitter, then a bridesmaid, then an alibi for our mother on nights she didn't want explained. I gave all of it, on time, without being asked twice, and I told myself that was what family meant. I was the vending machine. Put in a request, get back exactly what you wanted. No coins required, no thank you expected. It took me a long time to notice nobody ever put anything back in, and longer still to notice how small I'd learned to make myself so the machine would keep running smoothly. Our mother left when I was 13, and after that, my father worked 2 jobs to keep the house, which meant most of the actual parenting of Derek and Sasha fell to me by default, rather than by anyone asking if I wanted it. I packed their lunches. I signed their permission slips and a passable copy of his signature when he was too tired to do it himself. Nobody thanked an 11-year-old for that, and by the time I was old enough to notice the imbalance had already calcified into the shape of who I was allowed to be in that house. My father noticed, eventually, in the quiet way he noticed most things, too late to undo it, but not too late to feel the weight of it. He used to tell me, in the last year of his life, that he was sorry he let me grow up first so everyone else could stay young a little longer. I never knew what to do with that apology, except keep it, the way I kept everything else. 18 months before my father died, I found $300,000 in unreturned loans sitting in his bank statements, spread across 2 years of transfers nobody had bothered to disguise particularly well. I decided to do something my family had never once seen me do. I decided to wait and to build a file instead of a fight. The invitation came from Sasha, framed the way all her invitations were framed, as a gift she was extending rather than a favor she was asking for. "Welcome home dinner," she wrote in the family group chat, the same thread that still had my father's name in the contact list, even though nobody in it had heard his voice in over a year. "Dad's been through so much. Let's make it special for him. Feel like old times." Nobody in that thread knew our father had died 14 months earlier in a hospice bed 40 minutes from my apartment, with my hands on his and nobody else's in the room. I remembered a different kitchen from long before any of this, the house we grew up in, where I was 9 years old standing on a step stool next to my father while he taught me to read a bank statement like it was a bedtime story, tracing his finger under each line item. He used to say the numbers never lied, only the people describing them did. That kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and the cedar shelf paper my mother lined every drawer with, and it was warm in a way the rest of my life mostly wasn't. I held on to that memory longer than was probably healthy, the way you hold on to the one photograph from a trip that went badly otherwise. I drove to Sasha's house on a Sunday afternoon in early spring, past 2 highway exits I could have taken to visit our father's grave instead, And I counted down the miles the way you count down to something you already know is going to hurt before it happens. 12 miles out, I checked that the folder was still zipped in my bag. 6 miles out, I rehearsed the first sentence I might say, then decided against saying anything until it mattered. 2 miles out, I passed the turnoff for the old house we grew up in, sold now to a family with 2 young kids whose swing set I could see from the road, bright plastic against a yard that used to be ours. Her house smelled like the candle she always burned when company was coming, cinnamon and vanilla, laid thick over something underneath it that didn't quite disappear, some low current of tension that never fully left that house, no matter how good the candle was. Derek was already in the kitchen, loud about a bottle of wine he wanted everyone to admire, some vintage he'd apparently researched for the occasion. Marcus, Sasha's husband, was setting the table, with the good plates, the ones with the gold rim that only came out for company or for guilt, and in my family those 2 occasions had started to look identical. My cousin Whitney was there too, the way she always managed to be there, close enough to the family to claim a seat at every table, and far enough from any of its debts to never once be asked to help settle one. The dining room table was set with a white ranunculus that Sasha had clearly bought that morning, still tight in bud, next to a stack of cloth napkins folded into the shape of little fans, the kind of touch she reserved for company she wanted to impress rather than family she was simply feeding. A playlist of soft piano standards ran under everything, low enough to seem accidental, deliberate enough that I knew she'd chosen it. On the counter sat a chocolate cake with a slightly uneven top, clearly homemade rather than store-bought, the one detail in the whole house that felt like it belonged to an actual person instead of a performance of one. I sat down at the same chair I always sat in, the one nearest the kitchen door, out of habit more than choice. 4 years earlier, at that same table, I'd found the first loan request folded inside a birthday card, a request dressed up as a joke about how expensive it was getting to be Derek. I still had the folder with me now, tucked in my bag under my jacket, and I'd carried some version of it in and out of that house 11 separate times over the past year, waiting for the dinner where opening it would actually mean something. The discovery itself had come from paper, the way discoveries in my line of work almost always do. 6 weeks after moving into my father's guest room to help him through what turned out to be his final months, I found a drawer in his home office he hadn't cleared out in years. 3 neat rows of wire transfer confirmations, rubber-banded by date, and beneath them, one signed loan agreement, hand-dated, hand-signed by my father in the shaky print he'd developed toward the end, and never once repaid by anyone named on it. Derek, twice. Sasha, 3 times. Derek again, the largest single transfer, timed almost exactly to the closing date on a house he never once mentioned needing help to buy. The pattern read like a claims file I would have flagged in my sleep, consistent amounts rounded to convenient numbers, consistent excuses about timing and cash flow, and a lender who kept saying yes because saying no had never once been modeled for him by anyone in his own family, including me. I sat on his bedroom floor with that drawer open in my lap and did the thing I actually do for a living. I built a timeline, one transfer at a time, until the story stopped being a feeling and became a number. Dolores, the hospice aide who came 3 mornings a week to help my father bathe and dress, found me sitting on that floor an hour later still surrounded by paper. She'd been doing this work for 20 years, long enough to recognize someone doing math they didn't want to be doing. She didn't ask what the drawer contained. She brought me a glass of water I hadn't asked for, sat with me for a few minutes, then went back to check on him. She was like that with everything in that house. Steady, no questions, just showed up and did the next thing that needed doing. She never once treated my father like a case file, only like a person having a hard year, and I noticed how rare that had become around him, even from people who shared his last name. I called my friend Yusuf that same night, a coworker from the claims department who'd become the closest thing I had to a sounding board outside of work. He didn't tell me what to do. He asked one question, the kind he always asked when a file at his own desk looked messier than it should. What would you need to see before you'd believe your own story? I didn't have an answer that night. By the end of the year, I did. I also spent several sessions that year with Dr. Marisol Kessler, a therapist I'd been seeing on and off since my 20s, who was the first person to ever use the word enabler in connection with my own name instead of someone else's. She didn't tell me to forgive my siblings, and she didn't tell me to punish them either. She asked me, more than once, what I actually wanted underneath the anger, and it took me most of that year to answer her honestly. I wanted, for once, to be the one who got asked how I was doing instead of the one who was expected to already know. The deeper problem was never the $300,000. Money is a total loss you can calculate down to the cent and still not understand what it actually cost you. The real damage was quieter than that. 30 years of being the only Ellison anyone could count on, and 30 years of that costing me the one thing money was never going to buy back, which was ever being asked how I was doing instead of what I could do for someone else. My father saw that before I did. He just never said it out loud until the very end, and by then, the only proof he'd left me was a will and a silence I had to decide what to do with on my own. I decided the money would come back on its own schedule, whatever schedule the courts required. My presence in that family, the version of me that showed up and gave and never once asked why, was a thing I was actually done loaning out for free. I closed the drawer that night, but I didn't close the feeling. It sat with me for weeks afterwards, low and steady, less like anger and more like the quiet click of a claim finally being coded correctly after months of sitting in the wrong file. I wasn't building a case against my siblings so much as building the first honest account of my life I'd ever kept, one where the numbers on the page finally matched what actually happened, instead of the version everyone else had agreed to believe. The counterplay started small, the way the good ones always do. I didn't confront anyone that first week or the second. I called an estate attorney named Renata Frost, a woman my company had used on 3 of our larger fraud claims, who looked at my father's documents the exact way I do, which is to say, without the slightest interest in how anyone might feel about them once they were finished. Renata helped me file the will exactly as my father had rewritten it 4 months before he died, the version naming me sole executor and sole beneficiary, the version he'd drawn up quietly with a different attorney after he found the same drawer I later found and did his own version of my job on it. He'd underlined one line of the loan agreement in red pen, the line where he'd written, "No further advances until repaid in full," a line nobody ever honored. I kept that page separate from the rest, folded into the back of my own copy, because it was the closest thing I had left to hearing him say any of this out loud. I told my siblings our father had suffered a stroke and was in a memory care facility that didn't allow outside visitors during his recovery, which was cruel in a way I have made a kind of peace with, because the honest version would have ended everything before I had the proof locked down. A year is a long time to hold a lie that size on your own. It is not a long time to finish tracing 18 months of transfers across 4 different accounts, close out 11 of my father's remaining accounts one by one, and get a probate court to sign off on a document my siblings didn't yet know existed. I picked the year deliberately, the way you pick a deductible you can actually afford. I didn't enjoy a single week of it. Renata's office was small and unglamorous, tucked above a dry cleaner, nothing like the marble and glass firms my company usually referred us to for the bigger fraud cases. She kept my father's file in a plain accordion folder, labeled only with his last name, no case number, which struck me as its own kind of respect. She read the loan agreement twice before saying anything, then asked me the same question Yusuf had asked in different words. What do you actually want the outcome to look like when this is over? I told her I wanted it to be true on paper, whatever that ended up meaning for everyone else. She nodded like that was the correct answer, the only one that ever held up in her line of work. 3 months in, Renata warned me that if any of my siblings suspected what I was doing before the accounts were fully closed, they could file their own competing claims against the estate, drag the timeline out for years, or worse, start moving whatever cash they could still reach before a court ever saw it. That warning was the reason I kept answering the group chat with clipped ordinary updates about a man who no longer existed to update anyone about. 6 months in, I sat through a birthday dinner for Derek's daughter and smiled through a toast that mentioned Dad getting better every day. 9 months in, Sasha asked if I thought he'd be well enough for the holidays. I told her we'd see, the same 3 words I'd used for 9 months straight, worn smooth from overuse like a stone at the bottom of a river. I kept a second folder that whole year, separate from the estate documents, filled with nothing but the birthday card, 4 years of transfer confirmations, and a single photograph of my father at his kitchen table the week before he died, still lucid enough to ask me, more than once, whether I was going to be all right after all of this. I never had a good answer for him either. I just told him yes, because that was easier than admitting I didn't know yet. We reconvened at Sasha's table on that Sunday, and Derek got to his real point before the appetizer plates were even cleared. "So, when Dad's back on his feet," he said, not quite looking at me, cutting into a piece of bread like the sentence cost him nothing, "Marcus and I were talking about the guest house renovation. Might be good timing to get it done before he's back and needing the space himself." Sasha nodded like this had already been decided somewhere I hadn't been invited to. "Family takes care of family," she said. The same 4 words she'd used the last 3 times she needed something from me and had never once used when I needed anything back from her. 3 weeks earlier, at a different family gathering, Derek had raised almost the identical request, dressed differently but carrying the same shape. Dad would want us to have some cushion while he's recovering. I'd let it pass then, the same way I let most things pass, filing it away instead of answering it. I redirected without giving anything away yet. I asked about the kids, about Marcus's new job at the dealership, about whether Whitney had finally found an apartment near the hospital where she worked. I let almost an hour pass that way, watching Derek circle back to the renovation twice more across the meal, each time a little more entitled than the last, like he was rehearsing lines for an audience he assumed would eventually agree with him, no matter how the rehearsal went. Whitney brought up money too, in her own register, mentioning she'd heard from her mother that Dad's accounts were probably just sitting there unused, and wasn't that a waste when people around him actually needed help right now? Then Whitney said something that stopped me cold mid-bite, my fork still against the plate. "I actually got a text from Dad's number last week," she said, already scrolling to find it on her phone. "Just said he was doing better, resting a lot. Weird you didn't mention that." For one long second, the floor of the whole plan shifted under me, because I hadn't sent anything from that phone in months, and I genuinely didn't know who had. It took me most of the next course to work out that her mother, my aunt, had been the one keeping that old number active, occasionally texting from it herself, trying to smooth things over between us, without understanding what she was actually smoothing over, or how badly that particular kindness could land. I'd have to deal with my aunt separately, later. For the moment, it meant I couldn't just walk in and tell my story the way I'd rehearsed it in the car. I'd need something in that room nobody could argue with, because apparently a phone number had already started arguing on my behalf in the wrong direction before I'd said a single word. A second complication arrived with dessert, when Marcus mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd already called a contractor about the guest house and gotten a preliminary quote, just to have numbers ready for Dad. "We're not trying to rush him," Marcus said, refilling his own glass without offering the bottle to anyone else at the table. "We just don't want to be the ones holding things up once he's ready to move forward." That was the moment I understood this wasn't only about patience anymore. If I waited past tonight, the guest house renovation might already have a signed contract behind it, and unwinding a contract is a different, uglier kind of file than simply refusing to fund one. Derek pushed once more, a third and final escalation before dessert plates were even cleared. "Honestly, Naomi, you've always been the practical one," he said, in the voice he used when he wanted a request to sound like a compliment instead of what it was. "You know better than any of us what Dad would actually want here. I'm just saying, don't let this drag on forever out of some kind of caution." I recognized the shape of it immediately, because he'd used a version of that same sentence on me at least 4 times over the years, always right before asking for something, always framing my own judgment as the thing standing between him and what he'd already decided he deserved. Sitting at that table, listening to my brother plan how to spend money that no longer legally existed for him, I understood the difference between a claim and a settlement in a way I never had at my actual desk. A claim is what someone tells you happened. A settlement is what the paper trail agrees to pay out once every version of the story has been checked against it, line by line, no matter how sincerely the story was told. My whole life, I had let my family's version of events stand as settlement because contesting it always felt like more work than simply paying whatever they said I owed. That was the deepest ache of the year I'd spent alone with a folder in my bag. Not the $300,000, but realizing how long I had been settling claims I never should have paid out on in the first place, and how close I'd come to doing it one more time tonight, on bread and wine, out of nothing but habit. I'd texted my aunt from the driveway before dinner, the first direct message I'd sent her in months, asking her plainly to stop using that number. She hadn't answered yet, and I decided that was a conversation for another week, one that didn't need to happen at Sasha's table in front of everyone. Whitney's phone could wait. The folder in my bag could not. Sasha stood to clear the appetizer plates, and on her way past the sideboard, she picked up our father's chipped blue coffee mug, the one that had sat in her kitchen cabinet since the day we cleaned out his house together, the one none of them knew I'd let her keep on purpose because I wanted to see what she'd do with it once the truth finally landed. "I thought I'd bring this out when he gets here," she said, turning it over in her hands, tracing the hairline crack along its side with her thumb. For old time's sake. That was the moment I opened the folder. I didn't raise my voice. I laid 3 things on the table in order, the way I'd lay them out for any adjuster reviewing a closed file. First, the death certificate, dated 14 months earlier, county seal in the corner, the date everyone in that room had spent a year not asking closely enough to ever notice the gap in their own story. Second, the signed will, the one naming me executor, the one none of them had seen because none of them had thought to ask their sister for a copy instead of simply assuming what it said. Third, the drawer's contents, copied and organized the exact way I organize every file I'm ever asked to defend in a hearing, the loan agreement, the transfer dates, the running total, $300,000 laid out in a single column that didn't need me to argue anything on top of it. Derek's first reaction was disbelief dressed as anger, the false hope stage, the part where he still believed there was a version of this he could talk his way back out of. "This has to be some kind of mistake," he said, already reaching for his own phone like he could dial his way into a different outcome. He called the estate attorney's office number printed at the bottom of the will, on speaker in front of everyone at that table, and Renata's paralegal confirmed, calmly and without any interest in his tone, that probate had closed 9 days earlier, and all named distributions had already been finalized under the executor of record. Derek's face moved through 3 visible stages while he listened, and none of them were the stage he'd clearly been hoping for. He tried a second call after that, this time to the bank listed at the top of one of the transfer confirmations, and the automated line read back an account status that used the word closed twice in the same sentence, flat and mechanical, the way a machine tells you something a person would have softened. Marcus, still holding his wine glass, asked if maybe the hospice records could clear this up instead, some mix-up with dates, and before anyone could stop him, he was already on hold with the memory care facility number printed on an old intake form Sasha had kept in her purse for over a year without ever calling it. The woman who answered was gentle but immovable. Their records showed no patient under that name admitted at any point in the last 2 years. The line nobody in that room could argue with had just confirmed itself twice from 2 separate institutions in front of everyone. For a moment, nobody at the table said anything at all. The piano playlist Sasha had chosen that morning was still running quietly under all of it, absurdly gentle against the sound of Derek setting his phone face down on the tablecloth like it had betrayed him personally. The white ranunculus in the centerpiece had opened slightly since we sat down, and I remember noticing that, the way you notice small, unimportant things in the middle of something enormous, because your mind needs somewhere ordinary to rest for a second. Sasha set the mug down harder than she meant to. A thin crack ran up its side that had been there for years already, one nobody had ever bothered fixing, because fixing it would have meant admitting out loud that it was broken. "Family takes care of family," she said again, quieter this time, her voice thinner than it had been all night, and I finally said the only thing I'd been saving for that exact sentence. "My father took care of family for 30 years. You spent the last 18 months of his life taking from him instead of asking how he was." Marcus reached over and squeezed Sasha's shoulder, the kind of gesture people make when they've run out of arguments and want it to look like support instead of the retreat it actually is. Whitney stayed quiet at the end of the table, scrolling back through that old text thread on her phone, finally working out whose voice had really been on the other end of it and looking a little sick about it. I stood up before anyone at that table could turn the silence into another negotiation. I left the mug where it was, cracked and empty on the sideboard, and I let myself out through the same door I'd walked through 11 times over the past year, this time without a folder in my bag, because there was nothing left in it that anyone in that house was still owed an explanation for. 3 weeks later, Whitney called to apologize. Actually apologize for the text thread and for every year before it where she'd sat close enough to our family's table to eat off it and far enough from its debts to never once help settle one. She told me her mother had finally admitted to sending those messages and that she'd made her promise to stop. It didn't fix everything between us, but it was the first time in years anyone in that extended family had corrected something quietly instead of waiting to get caught. Derek called too, but only to ask if there was any flexibility left anywhere in the will, any account I might have overlooked, any version of this where the answer was still yes. There wasn't, and I told him so once, plainly, without the softening I used to reach for automatically whenever he sounded disappointed in me. He hung up before I finished the sentence. Sasha never called at all. I heard through Whitney, months later, that she told people at her own job the money had simply been mismanaged by an out-of-state attorney, which was its own kind of small, sad proof that some habits don't break just because the file closes. My father's downfall in that family had started long before I ever opened that drawer, in 100 small yeses none of us had thought to question at the time. I didn't create it by walking into that dining room. I only stopped being the one who kept it from catching up with everyone else. Dolores sent a card a few weeks after all of it, just a short note saying I hoped I was taking care of myself now the way I'd taken care of everyone else all year. It was the kind of thing my father would have said if he'd had the chance to say it himself, and I keep that card in the same drawer where I keep the rest of his paperwork now, because it belongs with the rest of the record, even if it isn't the kind of record a court would ever ask to see. I still have his chipped blue mug. I picked it back up off Sasha's sideboard on my way out that night, because some things are worth keeping, even after the people around them have shown you exactly what they were willing to break in order to get to them. It sits on my own kitchen windowsill now, where I can see it every morning, crack and all. I don't tell this story because I enjoyed any part of it. I tell it because somewhere out there is someone sitting on a folder of their own, wondering if a year of silence is too long to hold, and I want them to know it isn't, as long as the silence is doing something other than protecting the people it's supposed to be protecting them from. If any part of this sounds familiar, here's the mechanism underneath it, the part that actually matters if you're the one holding the folder right now, instead of just watching someone else's. What protected me in the end wasn't anger, and it wasn't even the money. It was documentation built quietly over time before anyone else in the room knew there was anything left to contest. If you suspect a family member is moving money out of an aging or ill relative's accounts, the paper trail is what holds up later, not your memory of what somebody said at dinner. Get bank statements in writing. Request them directly from the institution if you have to, since verbal reassurances from a relative don't hold up in front of a probate judge, no matter how sincerely they were meant. Note the dates, the amounts, and any signed agreements, however informal they seem at the time, because informal is exactly how most of these start. A loan agreement scrawled on the back of a birthday card is still a loan agreement once a date and 2 signatures are on it. And if you're the one who ends up as executor, know that probate becomes public record once it closes in most states, which means you never have to argue with anyone at your own table again about what the will actually says. The court already did that math for you, in writing, with a seal on it, and no amount of dinner table pressure changes a distribution that's already been finalized. If you're the one being asked to fund something before a will has even been read, that's usually the moment to slow down. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to sit on a truth because the truth was the only leverage you had left.